Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you tales of transformation, love, and the lessons that shape our lives. Today's story follows Sarah, a struggling single mother, and William, a powerful billionaire, whose lives unexpectedly intertwine through a discovery that could change everything. Both haunted by their pasts, they embark on a journey of healing and redemption, finding connection in the most unlikely of places. Join us as we explore their emotional journey, filled with loss, hope, and new beginnings. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin today's story with us. Sarah Miller's life had always been a fight. From the moment her son, Lucas, was born, everything seemed to change. Life went from being a series of routine days to a relentless cycle of struggles. As a single mother, there were days when she felt as though she were running on empty, just trying to make sure that Lucas had food, shelter, and the kind of childhood she always dreamed of giving him, one filled with laughter and warmth. But dreams don't always align with reality. Sarah worked 2 jobs, barely catching a breath in between. By day, she cleaned houses for wealthy families, her hands perpetually stained with the scent of cleaning supplies, her back aching from the hours of scrubbing and mopping. By night, she waited tables at a small local diner, serving coffee to the tired and the weary, all while her thoughts never strayed far from Lucas, who was waiting for her at home. Every paycheck was a battle, spent to make sure the rent was paid and the lights stayed on. But the truth was, she was just getting by. She didn't have the luxury of slowing down or taking a break. Life demanded too much from her. Then one day, after months of hustling, an opportunity came, though she would have never imagined how it would change everything. Sarah had been hired as a maid in the mansion of one of the wealthiest men in the city, William Hamilton. It seemed like a glimmer of hope, an escape from the grim routine of her life. She couldn't believe her luck. It wasn't just the promise of higher wages that caught her attention, it was the possibility of something better. Something more stable for Lucas. When Sarah arrived at the mansion for her first day of work, she felt dwarfed by its sheer size. The towering gates, the long gravel driveway, the grand marble floors, everything in the house seemed like a world apart from the small apartment she shared with Lucas. The mansion was a palace, cold and lifeless in its perfection. The chandeliers sparkled above her, but there was no warmth in them. She wondered if she truly belonged in such a place. But there was no time to dwell on her discomfort. She was greeted by Mr. Thomas, the butler, a stern man with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through her. There was no question that he tolerated no mistakes, and his cold demeanor made it clear that she was to keep her distance. William Hamilton himself was no different. He barely acknowledged her presence, consumed by endless phone calls and meetings. His attention was never on her. His life was full of the noise of business, success, and perhaps even more emptiness. As Sarah walked through the halls of the mansion, dusting and tidying, she couldn't shake the feeling that the place was hiding something. It was all so grand, so perfect, yet so hollow. Despite the imposing nature of the house, Sarah's resolve never wavered. She thought of Lucas at home, eagerly waiting for her, his bright eyes the only thing that made everything worth it. As she worked in the mansion day after day, the lavishness around her felt like an endless reminder of her own struggles. Yet, it also pushed her forward. She had to make this work. If she could earn enough to create a better future for Lucas, she would bear any discomfort, any loneliness, or doubt. The days blurred into weeks, and Sarah adapted to the strict rules of the house. She learned to avoid the sharp gaze of Mr. Thomas and quickly realized that William Hamilton was a man of few words. There was no conversation, no warmth exchanged, only business. But she began to notice things that she couldn't ignore. The house, for all its beauty, lacked any sense of life. The rooms, though perfectly decorated, were devoid of personal touches, no family photographs, no mementos, nothing to suggest that anyone lived here. William moved through the mansion like a shadow, always focused on his next business deal, his next phone call, never pausing to look around or connect with the space. He was alone, in a house full of opulence. One day, while cleaning William's private library, Sarah stumbled upon something that would change everything. Hidden in a dusty corner of the room was a photograph, tucked away in an ornate frame. It showed a younger William, standing next to another man. The resemblance to her late husband, David, was so striking that it made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Her hands trembled as she placed the frame back where she had found it. How could this be? What did this mean? She couldn't quite process the realization. But the pull of the photograph stayed with her, gnawing at her mind. She resolved to keep this discovery to herself, for now. Meanwhile, Lucas, the curious, energetic boy she adored, couldn't help but ask questions about the mansion. He'd heard his mother talk about the job and pictured the mansion in his young mind as some kind of castle. Sarah chuckled at his imagination, knowing that his sense of wonder would take him far. But she also knew she had to be careful. She warned Lucas not to wander around, to stay home and not go near the estate. However, Lucas's curiosity got the better of him one afternoon when he snuck away after school to explore the gardens. The sight of Lucas running around the grand estate, his laughter ringing through the air, caught William's attention. From the second-floor balcony, William watched the boy with a distant look in his eyes. It was strange, a small, fleeting moment of recognition, something he hadn't felt in years. Lucas's carefree joy reminded him of a younger version of himself, before he had buried his own happiness beneath the weight of business and loss. But he didn't acknowledge it. Not yet. He didn't know how. Sarah, having noticed Lucas outside, rushed to apologize for his intrusion, expecting a reprimand. Instead, William surprised her. He simply waved her off with a casual, indifferent gesture and muttered, "Let him be." But there was something more in his voice. Something that Sarah couldn't quite place, curiosity. Perhaps. Or even a rare moment of warmth. In the following days, Lucas continued to visit the mansion more often. His innocent questions, his playful spirit, seemed to challenge William's carefully constructed walls of isolation. William, who had long ago learned to shut himself off from the world, was starting to feel something stir within him. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was enough to make him notice the boy, notice the life that he had once abandoned. And all the while, Sarah could not escape the image of the photograph. The man in the photo. Who was he? How was he connected to her late husband? And, most pressing of all, what did it mean for her and her future? She didn't know the answers yet, but she was starting to realize that the story of this mansion, and of the people in it, was one she couldn't ignore. The truth was there, buried deep, and Sarah had a feeling that it would change everything. Days passed, and with each one, Sarah felt herself becoming more entangled in the mystery that seemed to grow between her and the Hamilton family. There was something about that photograph, the way it lingered in her thoughts long after she had returned it to its place in the library. The resemblance to her late husband, David, was undeniable, and the more she thought about it, the more her heart raced with the realization that the connection between him and William Hamilton might be far deeper than she had first assumed. But what could she do with this discovery? She wasn't sure. William had already shown her no interest beyond what was necessary for the work she was hired to do. He was distant, lost in his own world of business, and she had no intention of overstepping any boundaries. Still, her curiosity gnawed at her. Every time she passed him in the hall, every time she saw him sitting by the fireplace or pacing around the grand rooms, the question lingered in the back of her mind. Who was the man in the photo? How did he relate to her late husband, David? Sarah couldn't ignore it forever. And then, one day, fate seemed to offer her an opening. Lucas had taken to exploring the mansion's sprawling grounds whenever he could. He was drawn to the beauty of the place, the ornate gardens, the shimmering fountains, and the grand statues scattered across the estate. Sarah had never allowed him to wander too far on his own. But the sight of her son's excitement, his innocent joy, made it hard to say no. She could never have imagined what would unfold on one of these afternoons. It was a warm autumn day when Lucas ventured into the garden once again, his laughter echoing as he ran among the flowers. Sarah, busy with her duties, didn't notice him at first. But when she did, her heart skipped. She rushed outside, preparing to reprimand him for wandering too far. But when she saw William standing on the balcony, looking down at her son, she froze. William had been watching Lucas with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a brief moment, His usually aloof face softened, and Sarah felt a strange, unspoken connection between them. He didn't seem to mind Lucas's presence in the least. If anything, he seemed touched by it. He turned to Sarah, offering her a curt, indifferent wave as if dismissing any potential trouble. "Let him be," he said flatly, but there was something in his tone that made Sarah pause, something more than mere tolerance. It was as though Lucas had stirred something in William, something buried deep within him. A memory perhaps, a lost piece of himself. After that day, Lucas became a regular presence in the mansion. He would spend hours in the garden, chasing butterflies or sketching pictures of the sprawling estate with crayons. William, once cold and indifferent, seemed to take notice, though he never showed it. He would occasionally pass by Lucas, watching him from a distance, but he never said anything. Yet, Sarah couldn't help but notice the subtle shift. He was softer now, more present in a way that had once seemed impossible. She couldn't explain it, but somehow, she felt that Lucas's joy was slowly thawing the walls around William's heart. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning the library again, she felt an overwhelming pull to return to the photograph. Her mind kept going back to it, haunted by the image of the young man standing beside William. She had to know more. There was no escaping the question any longer. What was the connection between William and David? In a moment of weakness, Sarah decided to take a risk. She reached for the photograph and took it from the shelf, her hands trembling as she examined it once again. It felt wrong, like an intrusion, but she couldn't stop herself. Just as she was lost in the image, trying to decipher its meaning, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Curious about the photograph. "Are you?" William's voice, low and unyielding, broke the silence. Startled, Sarah quickly placed the frame back in its place, her heart racing. William had entered the room without her noticing. His eyes locked on the photo, and for a moment, she wondered if he knew what she had been thinking. He paused, then, after a long beat, spoke quietly, almost to himself. "That photo is of my younger brother, Ethan," he said, his voice filled with something Sarah couldn't quite define. "He was everything I wasn't: kind, adventurous, always looking out for others. We were inseparable as children, but life pulled us apart." The words hung in the air, and Sarah, taken aback, could see the pain behind William's eyes. It was the first time he had ever opened up to her about anything personal. He continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lost him in an accident. I've carried the guilt ever since. If I had been there that day, maybe I could have saved him." The weight of his words hit Sarah like a wave, and she felt an unexpected surge of empathy for him. She knew what it was like to lose someone, to carry the pain and the regret. But at that moment, she realized something she hadn't before. William was not just a wealthy, distant man. He was a man who had suffered, just like she had. He had a heart that had been broken, a soul that had been hardened by loss. Before Sarah could respond, her thoughts swirling, William's eyes met hers. For the first time, she saw vulnerability in him, a rare, raw honesty, and in that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just about the photograph anymore. It was about shared pain, the kind that bound people together in ways words could never explain. Sarah didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. She knew that, whatever the truth was, this moment, this connection, had the power to change everything. In the days that followed, Sarah couldn't shake the conversation she had with William. The revelation about his brother, Ethan, had changed the way she saw him. He was no longer just the aloof, distant billionaire who walked through his mansion like a ghost. He was a man who had suffered a loss so profound that it had molded him into the person he had become. The pain he carried was evident in his quiet demeanor and the way he kept the world at arm's length. Yet, something about their conversation lingered with her. She had never imagined that someone like William Hamilton, so detached and consumed by business, could be so vulnerable. The image of his younger brother and the grief that had followed shook Sarah to her core. It made her realize that perhaps, just perhaps, William was not so different from her. They both carried the burden of loss, even if their lives seemed so different on the surface. As the weeks passed, Sarah noticed subtle changes in William. His usual sharp, businesslike manner began to soften. Though only slightly. It was small things, like when he would glance at Lucas and give him a fleeting smile. Or when he would sit with his head tilted, deep in thought, as though lost in some long-forgotten memory. Lucas, unaware of the weight of what was happening, continued to be his joyful self. His laughter echoed through the mansion, bringing a life that had long been absent. It wasn't just Lucas's presence that was having an impact, though. Sarah, too, was beginning to change. Her initial fears and hesitations around the opulence of the mansion and the coldness of its inhabitants had started to fade. She began to feel more at ease with her role in the household, growing more comfortable with the routine, even if the mansion itself still felt like a foreign land. But Sarah couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that there was more to uncover. The photograph, still nestled in the dusty corner of the library, continued to pull at her. She was certain now that the man beside William in that picture was her late husband, David. But what did that mean? What was the connection between David and William? How had they known each other? The question weighed heavily on Sarah, but she was unsure if she was ready to confront it. She knew that revealing her discovery could open a door she wasn't sure she was prepared to walk through. Yet, as days passed, it became clear that the bond between William and Lucas was growing stronger. Lucas's innocent curiosity and unguarded joy had begun to reach William in ways that even Sarah couldn't fully comprehend. One afternoon, as Sarah was finishing up her duties, she found Lucas and William sitting together in the study. The two were engrossed in a game of chess, something Sarah had never imagined she would see. Lucas, with his childlike enthusiasm, had asked William to teach him how to play. It wasn't just the game itself that caught Sarah's attention. It was the way William was interacting with him. There was a warmth in his voice, a tenderness that she had never seen before. The game seemed to unlock something in William, something buried deep inside him. As the game progressed, he began to share stories from his childhood, stories about Ethan, their adventures together, and the bond they had shared before tragedy struck. His voice, though steady, betrayed a depth of emotion that made Sarah's heart ache for him. Lucas, ever the listener, absorbed every word. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, he eagerly shared the stories with Sarah. He told me about how him and his brother used to stay up all night playing chess. Just like us. Lucas beamed, the innocence in his voice, the sheer joy of hearing about William's childhood, struck Sarah profoundly. Here was a man who had been so closed off, so solitary for years, now sharing his past, his memories, and it was all because of Lucas. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah noticed more changes in William's behavior. He smiled more often, his once rigid tone softened, and he even started to engage in conversations with her about things that weren't business-related. At first, these moments were brief, fleeting, but they were enough to make her believe that perhaps he was finally starting to open up. One morning, as Sarah was dusting the library shelves, she saw William standing at the doorway. He was holding a cup of coffee, his usual business attire replaced by a more relaxed shirt and slacks. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. Without speaking, William walked over to the bookshelf, his gaze falling on the same photograph she had seen so many times. After a long silence, William spoke softly, almost to himself. "I never got to say goodbye to him," he murmured. "Ethan, he was my anchor. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to feel anything anymore." Sarah's heart ached for him. And in that moment, she understood. She understood the walls he had built around himself, the isolation he had chosen to endure in order to avoid feeling the pain of losing someone he loved. But now, she saw a glimmer of hope in him. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to let that pain go. It was in that moment that Sarah knew it was time to confront the past. To ask the questions she had been avoiding. She had to know the truth, about the photograph, about David's connection to William. It was time to take that step. And somehow, she felt that in doing so, both of them might find a little peace. As Sarah stood there, facing William, she realized that they were both standing at a crossroads, two people bound by loss, but also by a shared desire for something more, something deeper. They had both been living in shadows, hiding from the pain of their pasts. But now, there was a new beginning on the horizon. William, for the first time in years, had let down the walls that had isolated him for so long. And Sarah, with her quiet strength and love for her son, had brought warmth back into his cold world. I think it's time for both of us to stop running from our pasts, Sarah said softly, her voice steady. We can't change what happened, but we can honor those we lost by living the way they would have wanted us to. William looked at her, his expression softening. There was no more distance between them. No more silence. Just understanding. You're right, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's time to make it count, not just for us, but for the people who believed in us. As the days passed, the mansion transformed, not just physically, but emotionally. It became a place filled with laughter, stories, and new beginnings. The foundation they created together opened its doors, providing opportunities for children who needed a chance, just like Lucas had. And through it all, Sarah and William discovered that true healing came not from wealth or success, but from connection, love, and a shared commitment to make the world a little brighter. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about transformations, love, and life's profound lessons, be sure to subscribe to our channel for the latest videos. Life stories like these remind us all that no matter how broken we may feel, there's always a chance for a new chapter.